Here is the scheduled as planned reflection at the conclusion of our second official episode. To be uh, absolutely clear, we played a pilot episode. We played then the first sort of actual episode. The pilot was called The Nature of Threat, and the first episode was called Questions of Duty, and we have just completed the next episode through several sessions of play called Court of Opinion. So, what do we see? How's it been going? What's the reflections on play, on us, and who are we as a group of role players, as revealed or expressed through this game? Well, the first answer is that as far as Star Trek Adventures as a system is concerned, I think Casey and I and Anthony have found a groove that sort of implies that we're just going to do that from now on, but that's not quite what I mean. But the way we talk and the way we interact about the rules and our characters is coming clear and comfortable. So that's all good. The main thing to look over at Anthony's side of things, the only thing I can say is that he's hit his notions of where threat goes, how it's going to come about, how much of it seems to proliferate, and then what does he do with it, and how does he reconcile that or adapt to that via his notions, his preferences about what makes in this case, a TV episode of this kind of Star Trek. So all of that, is great. Threat is an interesting mechanic. There have been antagonist pools or GM pools or any number of these other kind of budget is what it's been called in Primetime Adventures. I think we're all familiar with the concept, and this is yet another implementation that has a number of properties. In the game Universalis, which doesn't quite have that same mechanic, but it kind of has a shared version of that mechanic among everyone, there was a real tendency toward inflation. So the amount of this currency basically just proliferated very rapidly, and the tendency therefore was for anything that you would have had to kind of budget for and prioritize over early in play just becomes available because everything's now cheap. So the tendency, instead of for play to focus, was for it to just sprawl and sprawl and sprawl and sprawl. So games since then have been very focused on basically getting rid of it, and there's some economics there that's interesting to talk about. But in this case, for Star Trek Adventures, the real answer seems to be use it. It can't be abused. Use it. So it's a little bit like what the players quickly learn about momentum. Momentum decays not rapidly, but a little bit. If you don't use it, you will lose a point of it, which basically just means, generate a lot and use a lot. If you lose one, therefore, don't sweat. See if you can, if possible, get as much going as possible. And when you don't have it, well, you don't have it. Now we're in a situation where the characters are a little more desperate, or circumstances are anyway. So that's momentum, and it's very easy to understand. It's very much a player side, moment to moment, more short-term thing. Threat is all session long. It doesn't decay. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger unless you use it. So you just use it, pretty much as it comes in, or you let it bank up a bit for a great big splash at some point. But the point is not to just keep waiting, and then you're looking at all this resource and going, what am I supposed to do with this? Especially if you've been bringing in things that basically should have been threat, and you've been bringing them in kind of ad lib and sort of absent any currency usage. Then the threat is really looming there like some kind of tumor, and you're kind of wondering what to do. I'm not saying Anthony went through that at all. I'm thinking about the way I've handled these kinds of games before and the sorts of things that have cropped up. Well, anyway, all of that is to say that in this case, we are confronted with a situation that, much like the first episode, is a combination of necessary backstory continuity. In the case of Questions of Duty, it was continuity from a previous actual Star Trek episode. In this case, it's continuity from the characters' backstories and some events during play. So those all come with implications, and as I understand it, Anthony treated those very much in their skeletal, the things we know with no assumptions attached, and made use of threat not only as things are more dangerous and tougher, than you thought, and there's more of them, but much more in the sense of actually providing content as well. So it's a little bit like what he and I have been batting around as ideas of, just how much content do you make up? How much content do you let threat represent? You could come in with a ton of content, and then threat is strictly about how, beefy it is. And other things like, how many unknowns are going to be remaining to, get their own way that you don't deal with, stuff like that. Or it can be really about content. Really don't prep much, and except for the bare bones. And as I say, our bare bones in this case were fairly hefty. Now, the effects are evident in the episode. It really, turns into a nicely escalating, nicely kind of, oh no, here it comes together. Characters realized things, I think, in ways that were very satisfying. I don't idealize the idea that the player has to realize it at the same time the character has to realize it. The game of making those two, non-attracting ends of magnets finally match is not particularly satisfying, no matter how much you idealize that effect. Plays very enjoyable when the player figures it out first and the character hasn't yet. Plays very enjoyable when the character does figure it out and the player hasn't yet. All of those things are fine as long as you just let that ideal go. Well, anyway, in this case, however, they weren't very far apart. Just how the system and our play continued, and the fact too that some of this was created through threat content and its revelation. It's not that something was hanging there waiting for us to get our shit together and figure it out. It was more like, all right, here it is. It snaps together, and so the character's figuring it out at the same time that, quote, we figure it out, in the sense that it's just snapped together, could be nicely corresponded. It was, if you like that particular correspondence, then the game delivers on it. You just have to kind of give up on the idea that the thing to be realized has been planned long, long ago. Well, anyway, interesting bunch of variables kind of intersecting there to talk about, that's for sure. One thing I really wanted to get into is to follow up on what has been revealed through comments. We venture into the terrifying zone of, well, when you said this, I thought you said that. And so when I said that, then you thought I meant that I said that. And we get into this nonsense of multiple nesting and backtracking of responses, which I hate. I will dip a toe into those waters, and I truly hope that it is a toe that is dipped and then withdrawn, dried off, and the walking proceeds away from those waters. Good luck. Now, what I'm talking about shows up with both of these episodes. One of them goes back to Questions of Duty. Now, when we were chatting up, how we wanted to do things, what things interested us, I'll get back to that phrase in a moment. When we were talking it up way back when, one of the things that was mentioned, Anthony remembers it as me, it may have been, was to say, hey, look at all those, messed up diplomatic situations that the Enterprise got itself into and either flew away from, leaving diplomats behind. Even in one particular episode, the characters even say, well, that's for the diplomats to decide, and go away. Or in other cases, there's a diplomatic mess and the people in the Enterprise typically apply a little bit of, the mythological version of lateral thinking, basically cutting the Gordian knot, sometimes literally. And anyway, the implication is that there's these ongoing, diplomatic and negotiatory things happening all over the place, and the Enterprise gets itself mixed up in those in a variety of ways. So that's a really long way of saying, somebody said, probably me, think about all those screwed up situations where, some sort of emergency response is actually called for. And let's be careful here. All right. I'm going by the stated record. My statement along those lines actually didn't include the presumption that we would be working directly from known old Star Trek episodes situations. Looking back on the conversation, or at least the report of the conversation, I can see exactly how somebody would assume that's exactly what I meant. That we were supposed to take an older episode and go, we can revisit that spot now that the Enterprise has gone, and look, there's a bit of a mess there of some kind, and it has itself kind of metastasized into a situation where the Avicenna needs to be called. Well, very logical and very consistent with the notion of loving the old Star Trek. I get that. In my case, however, it's totally not where I was going with it, and was much more in the idea of inventing a new novel situation that's like one of those, and then we go to deal with that. So the sort of excitement of, hey, guys, we're doing what you said. Look, we're basing it on this old episode, and it's a diplomatic, kerfuffle that's turned violent, and, that the Enterprise kind of left behind, and what are you going to do about it? And the fact that I just did not gel with that in Questions of Duty at all. We're going to the Helena system. And it was kind of like, as I said before, do we have to? So the combination of those ideas, first of all, this kind of situation, and then second, the direct and invocation and inclusion of the previous series episode, those two things just weren't together in my mind at all. So something similar happens, although less, I guess. I'm not saying that was a fraught situation. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Those slightly differing interpretations or priorities or preferences are welcome, right? Nobody has to play the way I want. So anyway, and I'm here with us, right? I'll play with what we all bring as our preferences and our responsibilities. So I'm good. But the same thing applies to a lesser and perhaps less fraught for some extent with Court of Opinion. And in this case, it has to do with the characters' backstories coming in. I've mentioned for a while now that the starting characters are pretty rich for the equivalent of starting characters in a startup series. Now, since the text and the fandom on which the entire game is predicated is very much more verse-oriented, a universe, a Star Trek universe, much more oriented toward characters in this universe are rich characters. A character worthy of being a protagonist comes with, weight, comes with backstory, comes with nuances and considerations. That each alien race comes with its own, interesting history and layers of cultural, nuances of all kinds. All right. I get that. So making up my character, he ends up being a character that I look at and go, oh, that's a pretty meaty guy. This guy's got all sorts of interesting ideas or experiences. There's no way he's going to have a very straightforward view of life. And, it's going to be kind of hefty to, ride him and the different ways he can go at the same time as we're riding the situation and the different ways it can go. That's not a bad thing, but it's rich, right? There's a lot of zones of perspective right? Which value am I going to express? Or better yet, I'm playing the character and then I look at the sheet and say, oh, look, I complicated it. I think a value is getting complicated here. Am I missing something or something like that? So anyway, in this case, here's where the interesting, again, what we said, what we heard comes in. I roll in the tables that he has, one of his prior adventures is an alien artifact. Okay. I wrote down, there's an alien artifact in play here. Now, what didn't occur to me, nobody said it, I'm not saying they should have, was that the alien artifact could have been left out of play. That it could have been an experience that was over and done with long ago. And the questions that it asks, like what does it do and stuff like that, to me, I read very much as in the present and now in play. So I was thinking that's one of the things. So I'm looking at Korsakoff and going, wow, all this, and he's got this alien artifact. I mean, yeesh. So it's not just some thing that he'll reference once in a while, back on such and such. I learned about alien artifacts. Here's a new alien artifact. That means I can, roll better. I have a focus. Whereas in this case, I'm reading it because it's talking about like, what does it do? And, who made it and all this kind of stuff. And I'm going, all right, this thing's in play. So when we talked about it, and I said, yeah, well, I guess he's got this alien artifact in his quarters. If it's is it going to be a secret, So all of that was, if you want to look at it this way, in ignorance of the fact that I had the option, apparently, to say, it's over. There is no artifact in play. That's in the past. So I don't know if I would have done that. It's a pretty hefty piece of Trek to have an alien artifact around. It's not, it's not untempting. So who knows? I could well have, preserved that same decision if I had known differently. But as it is, I didn't know differently, and the artifact is now a part of play, and we wrapped it into the backstory of the whole series, in ways that were perfectly consistent with the stuff we decided about it. And what I'm really meaning is that we had more of a Bible for the series, a source book, for the series, through things like our character roles that all stepped into play. They didn't become pure backstory, things that we might reference and that wouldn't really intrude into situations on their own 2 feet. No, we have them walking on their own 2 feet and they are in the room with us. I mean, all of our backstory stuff. So it's pretty rich. And so even starting this episode with 1 or 2, in this case, 2 little things treated skeletally, only with what we knew. We don't know how potentially, malevolent, however well-intentioned, Yang's parents are going to be. We don't know just how deadly or how malevolent the resurrection of these crew members, were. We didn't really know how much of them was left, as human beings. All sorts of things, for all we knew. I mean, hypothetically, let's say no threat got generated, like none. Okay. So then we have our resolutions and we have our situations go on and so on. And let's just say for whatever reason, Anthony is the teeniest piddly amount of threat. And maybe Captain Anders is fine. He's all better. And we need to resolve the business about, okay, we lied a little bit, sorry, but, it was a good idea, don't you think? We didn't really know. And carried on from there. And he would be fine, maybe be reinstated as the Avicenna and be a beloved leader, from this point forward. So it was played, I think, very much in that sense. We'll see how much threat gets generated and we'll see how much danger this turns into and of what kind. And it worked out very nicely, but it is worth thinking that a lot of the richness of the backstory for each episode so far has been rooted a bit in this business of how much we're treating as known stuff for the series. So that if you bring in X, it just has to be dragging a whole parachute behind it of nuances, stuff, complications. It's not non-neutral. It's already basically dragging a bag of unpaid for complications and unpaid for threat. Well, is this a problem? No, it's a feature of how we've been playing and how we've been communicating. One proposed solution in terms of role-playing history, and it's very commonly proposed and it often mandated, is, well, we have to talk all this out beforehand. And if we all figure we understand it, well, we need one more round around the consensus circle for everybody to paraphrase exactly what they feel that they heard and get corrected about that. And so we have achieved maximum pod people comprehension of precisely what we all mean, want, prefer, and assume, and everything about what can happen and how we're going to do it. I have played that way. I do not regard it highly. I regard it as, if you were to take the analogy that I prefer, which is playing music together, and you say, this is how it is, and from now on, no surprises, and no, oh, you looked at that differently, or nothing. That's all strife. We want no strife. Well, I don't see it as strife. I see it as different people sitting into the chairs than some other set of people who could have been sitting in the chairs. And I see that what we do in play is what we do in play, regardless of, moments of me saying things like, what, the Hellenist system? Really? Not because of a dislike for the Hellenist system, but because of the fact that it's a known feature from the first series. And is that bad? I mean, has Anthony failed to understand what interests me? Was I unclear about expressing what interests me? No, I hate all that garbage. And I called it garbage during the table talk. And it challenging, actually, Anthony's use of the term what interests the players, learning what interests the players. And my point of view is just incredibly opposed to that. I really want us all to be coming with what interests us. We arrived at a degree of working consensus, and necessarily imperfect, necessarily open, right, to, with unknown edges, open to whatever, beyond its limits, because it was a small zone of understanding and consensus for how we're going to do this. And that's how I want it. From that point on, both whatever it was that you, whoever you are, assumes about that, you're going to be bringing in as your assumptions, and they will be expressed insofar as you have specific responsibilities during play. Whether you're the game master, you have these responsibilities. Whether you're a player of a character, you have those responsibilities. And if the preferences about it, if the assumptions about it, if the directions, that are discovered in play about it are different per person, then I say, vive la différence, right? We will play, and our stories, if you want to use the S word, which result, will have emergent properties based on those. And there's no sense of, wait, you misunderstood me when I said that, as if it were a violation. No, that comes with the territory. And I say the more of it, the better. The more that the preferences you bring in, because I think everybody here is operating on great good faith and isn't going to be, shit posting, shit playing, basically, and isn't going to be, sort of reflexively batting away things that come sailing at them, and isn't going to be bringing up like weird priorities of, who knows what, right? But instead, we'll be bringing in aesthetic good faith, and enjoyment of what they're doing. And that's what I want. If everybody's coming in with the maximum sense of enjoyment of what they're bringing in, I will embrace your enjoyment of it. All of us together doing that. And that's where I think our enjoyment of this game now sings, is when we do that and nobody's trying to guess what will interest anybody else. Nobody's trying to pave the way for more fun for other people. And so that's my position on that particular feature and how it relates to our game. Blah, blah, blah. Does he have more to say? Curses. Maybe this should be saved for some other time, but when I do that, then things get lost and forgotten. So last bit, promise, it has to do with the nature of playing supporting characters, and we talked about whether we would bring in more people to play. Whether anybody's approached Anthony to join our group, especially since we have lost a player, I don't know. He referred to it, but it might have been a joke, so I don't know if that's true or not. And I don't really care. But the question does come up. Do we ask about to see if anybody would like to join us? And the viewpoint, speaking of consensus, apparently we held very similar views, all three of us, which was that the main reason for no is the supporting cast. Because each of the supporting cast has been played by at least two of us. And at the moment, since we have 2-player characters, many of them have been played by both of us, and we are starting to take great pleasure in saying, wait, I haven't played that person yet. Give me that person. And so each of the supporting cast is now very much has a composite history of what they've done. And the net effect has been a really nice matrix of activity, because now they're gaining values, and now they're gaining foci, and now they're gaining a history of activity and dialogue. And all of this means that they're taking independent action. So this episode is where we see supporting cast members basically stepping up and doing stuff. And then we look back on how they've been played, and we're going, wow, given how you play that person, given how I play that person after that, given how you're playing this person again, that course of action is really satisfying to see. And sometimes that course of action is actually, a bit of a switch on what they've done. Sometimes it's not. So this is great. We have a different kind of player character at work here. This is familiar design territory for me. My game Spione is heavily based on this idea. And obviously Circle of Hands is a latter-day, very limited version of it, which is actually focusing on the player characters as such. And so I like this kind of thing, and I like the way that Star Trek Adventures has organized it in a particular way, and especially since the supporting cast members have their own developmental process in terms of mechanic that is different from the main characters' process of development from episode to episode. The supporting cast in particular, it has to do with appearance in sessions, I think. I'll have to double check that, whether it's got a different rate. If it's appearance in sessions as opposed to whole episodes, I'll have to check on that, see which one, if they're the same, whether it's just episodes or whether it's sessions. Well, that's not to the point here. The point here is simply that adding a new person into this is really a start over for that process. They're dealing with much richer supporting cast than they made. They had a hand in making, and therefore are being given sort of a creative expectation and a set of constraints that really can't be managed. I mean, you have not experienced the creation of those characters through play. You had no hand in it, and all of a sudden you get this nuanced person who's done all these things, had all this dialogue that you don't feel. And not only that, but then you are bringing in, starting new ones from scratch. And anyway, it puts the new player into a beta position relative to the other players that I think is not fair. And also, that stew of characters is becoming quite rich. We have a bigger set of player characters, effectively, than we started with. And that's a lot of people, to get into. I mean, how are you going to bring your own stamp into that? And how could it be anything but very much an orthogonal stamp? Anyway, it just doesn't seem fair to the fiction, and it doesn't seem fair to that person, and it seems onerous for us, no matter how nice that person might be or how much they really love what we've been doing. So anyway, as it turned out, the Casey and I basically both delivered, independently delivered a monologue saying exactly this. And Anthony said, I'm with you. That's really where I was coming from too. So that's where we end up with that. In the course of that, I made a cool little diagram, which is right here. The cool little diagram shows that each of us do have a main character that we are starting with. You can, see I have 3 players listed here, and so there's these main characters 1, 2, 3, and then you can see that supporting cast are mentioned as well. Now, supporting cast may have been created by somebody else. I'm talking now about who has sort of introduced them by saying they're in a scene, but more importantly, playing them first, taking over instead of playing your main character or anybody else, playing this supporting character. So you can see that, clearly they're going to be played by somebody first. So here's a supporting cast member who's played by player 1 for the first time. Well, as time goes by, move to the center of the diagram, you'll see that either player 2 or player 3 will also have played this character. And it doesn't matter if there's been more, player 1 has done it again, or I don't really care. The point here is just that the character's been played by more than one player at this point. Now, what I'm calling the hot zone is any supporting cast who have been played by all of the available players. So that means that this character has been, if you will, touched by human hands and has taken on a shape that they would not ordinarily have had. And probably by this point, they don't have to by the mechanics, but very likely by this point have been, gained a value or some other game mechanic that sort of makes them different from just your ruck and run of supporting characters. So that's what I'm calling the hot zone, is when you have characters, supporting cast, who are in that box. And at that point, as we have just discovered, play just like booms. There's a whole different way to play. And you have, action scenes with these characters going on at the same time as investigation scenes with these characters, and, negotiations or, hassle scenes with others. It's all going on at once, and it really has a nice, playable, clip-along feel to it. And you sometimes find yourself playing a character who hasn't received a whole lot of attention, and you walk in their shoes for a couple of seconds, and since you have the other hot zone characters, kind of going on, it's pretty easy to start, bringing this character into the eligibility for that zone, by, putting something into it. You say, well, this is a chance. This character can say a thing now. What is it going to be? Well, with all that happening, it's tremendously, wonderful, to play with this, and to bear in mind too, that this is only one structure for this concept. Circle of Hands has a different structure. Spiona has a different structure. There are lots of different ways to manage this particular variable. Paul Sega experimented hard with it in the late 2000s with a game in design called Acts of Evil, and he ran into some really interesting observations that led him to discontinue developing the game, but also were food for thought for everybody. And that might be something to talk about sooner or later for this variable. All right, there you go. Blah-de-blah. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. It was a hell of a lot of fun to play.